This podcast was produced by Morley Radio.
The door.
The door. The door.
The door.
The door.
Today on the Door History Podcast, we open the door on women who've lived in one particular street in South London in the 19th and early 20th centuries. My name is Naomi Clifford, and I'm joined in the studio by historian Tracy Gregory, who has researched the inhabitants of Loughborough Road in Brixton. Today, Tracy's going to tell us about the amazing entertainer Ella Zuila.
32 Loughborough Road.
Ella Zuila, heroine of the high wire, Australian funambulist. Ella Zuila lived at 32 Loughborough Road from 1891 to 1894. She was incredibly famous as a high wire walker and trapeze artist. She was originally born in Australia in 1854. Her parents were from England. Ella met her husband George, we don't know how, but soon trained on the trapeze and the high wire and travelled all round Australia and New Zealand with him for several years. In 1874, they joined a troupe of other performers and headed for Asia. They performed in Manila, Hong Kong, Ella on the high wire, swinging from her trapeze. And in 1875 in Singapore, she took a very short break. She was no longer appearing on the bill with all the other actors and performers. What was happening to her? Well, actually, it turns out she was giving birth to Lulu. She had been performing while pregnant on the high wire, as many acrobats did in that era. And her daughter Lulu was eventually to join the performance. But it's incredible to me that in the 1870s, these acrobats were travelling around the world on clipper ships, performing in far-flung countries when many people of that time in the UK were barely even going past the end of their own street. Obviously, London was a bit different. People were coming and going. So having performed all round Asia on the high wire and on the trapeze, Ella and her husband George, although he wasn't actually her husband at the time, and their baby headed off to Africa. They performed in Mauritius and all around southern Africa, setting up their own tents and their own equipment. Again, it was an incredible feat of performance in itself, just to construct the high wire with the towers and the wires strung between it. They arrived in the UK in 1877, but didn't stay very long, possibly not getting the bookings they wanted. So off they went to the Americas. They travelled to Brazil, to Venezuela, getting caught up in a coup, then on to Cuba, Barbados, and then travelled all around the US with various circuses. Their baby Lulu was growing, and she joined the performance with Ella pushing baby Lulu across the high wire in a wheelbarrow. Other parts of Ella's performance were her walking across the high wire with baskets on her feet. She stopped in the middle of the wire with a table and drank a glass of wine. What else did she do? She carried her husband across the wire on her back. And she also pushed a cannon across the wire. And that was a nod to the performance that she developed with her husband in the US, where he was fired from a cannon and she was hanging from the trapeze and caught him. That act didn't last very long, needless to say, and George was reported as the first man to be fired from a cannon. The first woman and the very first person was actually Zazel, another performer who was also based in Brixton for a short time. But back to Ella. They came back to the UK in the mid-80s, 1880s that is, and Ella continued to perform. She was really at the top of the bill at that stage, and Blondin is reported to have given her diamonds. That's Blondin who crossed Niagara on a high wire, and said that she was the best performer in his style, i.e. the best since he had walked across Niagara, and the best tightrope walker. So, as I say, they moved into Loughborough Road in 1891, continuing to travel around Europe. Ella performed at the Folies Bergère in Paris. She performed in Berlin, Vienna, And all round the UK. She performed in Blackpool, in Douglas, in the Isle of Wight. You name it, she performed there. And it was quite a dangerous pursuit. While performing in the US, she fell from the high wire at Tony Pastor's theatre in New York. And it was after that in America that they started to introduce nets to catch high wire and trapeze performers. And that was also introduced in the UK. She had other falls too, but she recovered each time, climbed back up the ladders, which took her up to her high wire, and continued to perform. Lulu started to grow, so from the small child being wheeled across the high wire in a wheelbarrow, she joined her mother on the back of a specially designed velocipede, a cycle that went across the high wire. She stood on the shoulders of her mother as they crossed the high wire together. And it seems that as Lulu became too large, she wasn't a big girl, but as she grew older, they started to bring in other children into the act. It's hard to know where these other children came from. They weren't Ella and George's own children, and what happened to them afterwards, but certainly there were different young performers in the act. And Ella ran into a bit of trouble in the US with the child protection people. They were not enjoying the fact that she was wheeling small children across a high wire, and she knew they were in the audience, and one day she dropped a baby from the high wire. But of course it wasn't a real baby, it was just a doll full of sawdust. So she was just playing with the protection people. Acrobatic performers were actually the most vociferous against the child protection labour laws, because it was quite normal for them to recruit their own young offspring to be involved in their performances, and also bring on board other small young children that they would train up. So Ella and George moved on from Loughborough Road, but they didn't go very far. They moved to Flaxman Road in Loughborough Junction, continuing to travel. But George had almost entirely disappeared from the act. He was just managing Ella. And as I say, she was the top of the bill, earning lots and lots of money. And she appears in the press all the time. But we don't ever hear of her now. Very little has been written about Ella. She did retire, and she moved with George to West London, but he moved in with a lot of performing colleagues, and I don't think she moved in too, because all of those performing colleagues were men. And so Ella actually took a flat nearby and lived near to George. In her later life, she moved to live near her daughter Lulu in Walton-on-the-Naze. And she died in 1926, and there was just one small 3-lined obituary to her in the stage. Ella Zuila, once a famous high wire performer, died the other day.
Thanks, Tracy. That's amazing. And what an extraordinary woman. So she died in her 70s in Walton-on-the-Naze, living in a flat, you say. But did she manage to keep any of the wealth that she accumulated? How did she care for herself in old age?
I don't know for sure, but as I say, before she moved to Walton-on-the-Naze, she was certainly renting flats in West London, living in shared houses mainly, so that suggests that she wasn't very wealthy. She moved to Walton-on-the-Naze because that was where her daughter Lulu lived, and her daughter Lulu, who had developed her own performing high wire career, had by that time left performance and was running the Kino, the cinema in Walton-on-the-Naze. So maybe Ella moved there and was looked after by Lulu in her very old age.
Well, I'm very pleased that we've remembered her here, even though at the time she was rather forgotten when she died. Thank you, Tracy. That's wonderful. And thank you to Morley Radio for hosting the Door History Podcast.
The door. 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 The door.